Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today, we are going to talk about group experimental designs. So, how do we do actual experiments in social work? Do we experiment on people? Hmm. There's a boatload of ethical issues wrapped up in that. So it's, a bit of a balance between what is our ethical duty to improving our practice and giving people the best treatment available, and at the same time making sure that everybody is cared for and receiving what they need. And so, how do we do research informed practice and practice informed research? So, with all of that, we will dive on into chapter 7. Yay! Okay, so uh, I mentioned in an earlier video, we talked about what a spurious relationship. And so, particularly when we are talking about, the two different um, design alternatives, uh, we can focus more so on internal validity or external validity. Um, and specifically with the internal validity, we want to make sure that we do not have this spurious relationship where we think that maybe we've got this relationship between two variables, but really there's something else going on. There's a third variable that's impacting. And so we address this through randomization and comparison groups and um, requiring people to participate in the whole duration of the experiment. Then we've got the external validity, where we're focusing on generalizability. How broadly can we um, uh, ascribe that, hey, this works for my population as well as then everybody else outside. So as we are thinking about those issues here. Uh, as we get into internal validity, one of the main ways in which we address this is through randomization. So again, this randomizing and making comparison groups helps to reduce this spuriousness. So when we think about random assignment, it's basically putting, if we've got a bunch of individuals, we put one person into groups by chance. So, the experimental and the control groups are roughly equal in their composition at the beginning of the experiment. Now, if you think about maybe you've been in a class where I've used my group-o-matic generator, and so I have configured it to randomly put together groups. So you might use a tool such as that, where you have a whole list of participants, and then you randomly assign them to two different groups. Normally, I assign you to smaller groups, but I could just simply say, give me two groups out of 50 people and randomly assign them, and it would generate that list. So that would be one way in which we would go about it. And so the benefit of then having two groups is that we've got one which theoretically gets um, the new treatment, and then the other would either get no treatment or get the treatment as usual, or the TAU. Um, and so this helps to eliminate some of the other problems that might be within the study, such as, people having a certain history with it, or maybe if they think, in terms of the testing, that testing itself can actually influence um, the study and the instruments and um, various other components. So there's actually a couple of pieces here that we want to be aware of as we are going about um, the experiment. One is mortality, not the person actually dying, although that is a problem. But it's called differential attrition or mortality. So this is really where, in some experiments, people become, kind of the groups become too different because subjects in one may be more likely to drop out. than subjects, in the other group. Maybe it's too long, or it's one group is getting more benefits, or it's too onerous, and they're like, "Ow, I don't like, you know, receiving a shot or having to do this behavioral, treatment." Um, so, there can be different motivations that would then, impact who actually stays, and then, your groups might get a little lopsided. So then there's contamination, where this is where one group affects the other group, um, or is affected by the other group. And so can then influence your post-test results, because they start talking to each other, and maybe they're sharing information. And so you've got information that was delivered to one group, and then they share it to, their friends in the other group, and they've now contaminated the study, because now the group that was not supposed to get the information has it now. Um, there can be different expectancies. So this is where um, the staff um, has, like, they know who's in a particular group, and so they have some expectations, and so the people who are part of the study, they may have, some sort of uh, outcome that's actually not as a result of the treatment itself, but simply in as a result of the expectations. And this is kind of like the placebo effect, where the participants do receive the treatment, but if they know that they're getting the treatment, then they're likely to, and they believe that's going to benefit them. There's this psychological component that actually helps them get better. Um, so that's the placebo effect. And so they improve because of the expectation, not because of the treatment itself. Then on the other side, so that's what earlier, those were internal validity, that's within the experiment itself. Then we've got the external validity, how well can we generalize this? And unfortunately, a lot of the design elements that will reduce our threats to internal validity also make generalizability more difficult. So it's kind of a catch-22. Um, and so you want to, have, maybe some good diversity within your sample, so that way you can be able to generalize it. Maybe it needs to be large enough. So are you able to, differentiate among different populations, and is it replicable? Will it work under different types of conditions? So these are, some of the questions that you need to generally ask, and do your best to try and figure them out. Some of the ways in which we go about doing that is then through having true experiments. Now, the gold standard of a good experiment is going to be a randomized clinical trial. Now, this is not always feasible. It is not always ethical. So we have other forms of experiments that we can do that are quasi or even non-experimental. And so, there's different ways in which we can go about that. So we've got, but to be able to have and engage in this, kind of top standard of experiment, especially when we're talking about individuals and people. We're not, talking about mice. We're not talking about, minerals. But, where other randomized clinical trials or cells, where you might be able to do them with much tighter conditions. Here, we're working with people. So we've got experimental and control groups. So you've got two groups to be able to establish an association empirically between your independent variable of what you're starting out with and your dependent variable of what gets influenced. You've got that element of randomization. Um, and then, so that way you can conclude that the results in the experimental group were actually due to the intervention and not because of some quality that those people had. And then perhaps you need to measure before and after to be able to actually measure a change. And so can you quantify the difference in those groups and how they changed and to what degree they changed? Now, There, on page 167, there's a handy dandy little box that is your experimental design notation. And this was not actually in the PowerPoint, but I decided to put it in because I find it to be really, really useful visually for understanding and thinking through different structures of experimental designs or non-experimental design, but basically research designs. So R stands for a random assignment. And then you can have an O, which means, you've got an observation that is taken at some point for a variable. And then an X would mean that you've got some sort of intervention or treatment or something that's happening. And then you've got like little subnotations. So if you've got an experimental intervention, then you use that as a E, little e, or a traditional intervention. So this could be then say your treatment as usual. So that's the XT. And then you've got your different groups, group A, group B, group C, group D, so forth. Okay, so keep those in mind as we go through, and I've kind of popped in those visuals for us to be able to take a look at. So the first type of true experimental design is the pre-test, post-test controlled group design. This is where you have, random assignment. So we see that with the R. And then we've got random assigned group A and randomly assigned group B. Now, both of those have an observation. So this is the pre-test. So we've got our observation means we take a look at and do some sort of measure. Maybe it's on a depression scale or the financial well-being scale or something like that. So we do some sort of assessment to measure quantitatively where is our baseline here? Where does a person start at for each group? And they should be fairly similar. Then one of the groups then gets the intervention. So we see with group A, RA, the randomized group A, they have the intervention. So that's the X. Then group B, they do not have the intervention. So without the intervention, then we move on to the post test for both of them. And then that way we can see, in theory, Group A should have a different outcome than Group B. Group B, one would think they should be fairly, should be the same um, before as it is then after. Or there may be some sort of, implications of time that would take place. But in theory, it should be really no difference. Whereas then with Group A, we should see a difference as a result of the intervention. And then we know our intervention made an impact. All right. So that is perhaps the one of the simplest ones. Then we've got a post-test only control group design. So maybe we don't have access to folks, or maybe, this is everybody who has already, been within, has been admitted into a particular type of program. And so we're now we all know that, okay, maybe everybody, because they were allowed into the program, we know that they were at risk of homelessness, or everybody was struggling with a particular substance use disorder, something like that. Okay, so um, there can be kind of a testing effect. So if the person takes the test the first time and then they take the test the second time, do they remember what the answers were from the first time? So if you've taken the same test, yeah, you're only like, yeah, I remember that question. And I remember, how to answer it. And so you can have a testing effect. And so we want to perhaps minimize that. So we take out that pre-test and instead simply have a post-test or a treatment and then a post-test. Um, and then we compare the difference between them. Um, and so it can either be having a treatment versus no treatment, or having an experimental treatment versus the treatment as usual. So we see those two types there. Then we've got the Solomon four-group design. Um, this would be kind of every which way, the different combinations um, to understand all the different types of relationships and where we want to understand, is there actually a test impact that's taking place? So we have four groups, and we have one that gets these are all randomly assigned. Group A has your um, observation, experimental treatment, and another observation post-test. Group B, we see, we make one change where they get no treatment, but they have a pre-test, post-test observations. Group C doesn't have the pre-test, but they do receive the experimental treatment with a post-test observation. And then group D has only the post-test observation. So this is another way in which we can go about it that provides a little bit more insight into what's happening in the experiment. Now, some of these, a lot of these experiments, they can be very, prohibitively costly in terms of time and money. You got to have enough clients who are willing to take part in it. You got to have the resources and expertise to be able to do that. So, it's not something that's often very easy to be able to do. And so, and at the same time, a lot of times programs need to change and they need to adapt and be flexible to the needs of their clients. But you can't change a program right in the middle of a study. Otherwise, you don't know, well, what is a change or an improvement as a result of? Is it a result of the change in the program, or is it a result of actually the program working? We don't know. So, so the agency would not be able to change it, so they have to remain static. Um, at the same time, there's a bunch of other ways in which this can be challenging. Not all of us have the same skills, so the degree to which we're able to implement a program, is it due to the staff person or is it due to the program? Results might not work, especially if it's tailor made to a particular population and a particular location and a particular time. You might not be able to actually do much more with it than, understand, hey, are we better today than we were yesterday? But you can't generalize it more broadly than that. Um, and there's this adage that the best therapeutic approach is that a therapy is used. And it almost doesn't matter what type of therapy you use with a client, other than you have a therapy and you use something. Because so much is actually dependent on the relationship between the individual and the client, or then the therapist. And so, there can be, sometimes various therapists are like, hey, I know best and I know my clients best. And you're now, because of this experiment, I can't do any, I can't pick which one would actually be best for my client. Um, there's also, perhaps an assumption that new treatments are always better, and that may not actually be the case. Or maybe the clients just don't want to be experimented on. This is very legitimate, and some populations have had some very horrific experiences with this. So, these are some real ramifications that need to be considered and addressed. And so at the same time, they're not going to be and tell us everything that we want them to know and be. So they're not going to identify, the causal mechanism, and that says, yes, this was effective. So, there's is that causality piece sometimes is still limiting, and we can't really for sure know, because people live out in society. Um, and because of that, we can't impact unless we keep people in a bubble. It's tough to control the conditions that they are in. I took part in an experiment, and I had to be in a locked room for 24 hours, and it measured my breathing and it measured my heart rate. And I had to lie still for about 45 minutes every morning. I had to have a very restricted, regimented diet. These types of conditions were highly controlled. And then, I would go about the rest of my weeks after that. So, you know, sometimes that degree of control is not realistic. I was lucky. I could have my wife take care of my kids, otherwise, I can't have my kids with me there. So, these types of things can be very problematic. So sometimes we do with the best that we can, and sometimes that means doing a quasi-experimental design. So it's not fully experimental, but it has some elements to it. So in these cases, there's no randomization, but maybe we are able to have two different groups. And so we have group A and group B. So we can at least rule out some threats to the internal validity, whether we have, treatment versus no treatment or treatment versus treatment as usual. And so, there's we can have, that type of experimental design, and that's a non-equivalent control group, so non-randomized version of that pre-test post-test that we just saw. There's also then the time series. And so this can be looking at a longitudinal design. So maybe we just look at everybody. We only have one group, but we look at differences that they then experience over time. And so if we've got the willingness of the people to be in it for the long haul, and then we take multiple observations to see how time and how they do on their own, and then we introduce a treatment and then continue to observe. Maybe there's an initial impact and then things kind of level out, and we see, all right, well, are they able to maintain the benefits of that impact, or do they start to regress? Um, so, that's another way in which you can go about it. And then there's the ex post facto control group, where you've got, it's the same as the non-equivalent, but people get designated after the treatment has already occurred. So, you've got the baseline there, and you're just simply figuring out, okay, where do we have these two distinct groups that we can kind of compare? Others would be the one group pretest, post-test design. So basically, you got one group and you're like, okay, we'll do our best. And so we'll observe, we'll do the treatment, and then we'll do another observation again. We'll just see what happens. And so that can be, helpful for just gathering some data. Um, or maybe you've got an after only design. So this can be helpful, not for a whole lot, but maybe just good for piloting some material. And so one of the things that I did is I put together a financial education curriculum. I didn't do it as an experimental thing, but I gave folks the curriculum, and then I said, it's like, all right, what'd you think of it? And so, we had just a little bit of financial education to see, did it work? Or you can have um, a static two group design, no random assignment, and no pretest or base post-test. And I think that two groups, so it should be A and B. Um, Sorry about that. Anyway, so uh, uh, okay, yeah. So next, implications for evidence-based practice. One is, we need to consider randomization. How did that, take place? Were people, kind of all the same, or were we able to kind of bring a degree of systematization to that? How large was our sample size? I mean, to the extent that we only have 5 people in our study, um, that's not a whole lot. Whereas if we've got 500, that's going to provide us with some much greater statistical analysis. The attrition rate. Did people actually stay in the study? So that has a big impact. Now, one of the ways in which we can do this is through meta-analysis. And perhaps you've heard of meta-analysis. This can be a way of studying studies. So if there've been lots of researchers who have done particular types of studies on motivational interviewing or on a particular substance use intervention, or say financial education. And so lots of programs are doing financial education. Lots of programs will do a pre-test and then a post-test after they receive the information. And that pre-test will be like 5 minutes before they get the information. And the post-test will be about 5 minutes after they get the information. So everything is really, really fresh there. And one of the things that they were finding is that, hey, people increase their financial knowledge. I guess financial education works, right? Well, once a meta-analysis was done, and there was one that was done in, I believe, 2014. And so they took a look at all different types of financial education research programs. And as a result, one of the things that they found is that once they did, any types of follow-up later down the road, the people then had ended up forgetting a lot of the information, or they may have known the information, but their behaviors hadn't really changed very much. And so, in the end, one of the things that they found was that as they kind of cast this wide net, looked at all of the different types of research that was going on, was that financial education was really a waste of time and resources. It was not working. It was not producing the change in people's financial well-being that had been hoped for. People were simply, kind of responding to the test and testing well. But that was it. There was actually no serious outcome that was able to be observed. So this meta-analyses can be a really, really helpful tool to understand and to generalize these findings across many different studies rather than what one individual study could do. Now, another component here is that, sometimes based on various cultural differences and different populations or different socioeconomic groups, they may respond differently to different approaches to experiments. So, do different treatments work better with certain populations? So this can, has profound social justice issues. Um, Maybe, some folks work better in a group versus one-on-one interventions. Um, Maybe people don't trust a trained psychologist, but they trust their elders. There was actually a program in East Africa, excuse me, where I think it was maybe like Kenya or Tanzania. And basically, they didn't have enough therapists and they didn't have enough psychologists to meet the needs of all of the population. And it was a very rural population, especially out in the rural areas. But one thing that they did have were a plethora of elders, and they also had bus stops. And so one psychologist said, "Hey, if I give this grandmother a little bit of training, so that way, she knows how to talk and listen to folks. She's a trusted and respected person within the community, and maybe she'll just, sit at the bus stop. And as people, want to talk and share what's going on, they'll know, hey, there's my granny at the bus stop. I can talk with her. She's not going to tell anybody else, and she can provide some good counsel, and she's good at listening. And so this was a way of addressing mental health needs that otherwise would have gone unaddressed because the psychologist couldn't see everybody. And this was then a volunteer type of activity that helped to, provide mental health services and build closer networks within the rural areas. So, so we need to think about, what's actually going to work best for the population given everything that's going on. So some of the ethical issues, as I mentioned at the very beginning, have to do with, maybe are you giving treatment to one group and you're excluding and withholding it from another group? Is it ethical to do that? Maybe you're giving, some advantage to one group of people and disadvantaging another, based on a random basis. Is that an ethical thing to do? To address some of that, we give the control group the treatment as usual. What is the best that we have that we know already? But is it then ethical to give others something that may be better or may be worse? Or do we simply ensure that everybody gets treated the same and we simply stagger when they receive it? So that's another possibility that we actually haven't talked here about. You can give both of them the treatment. One just simply is withheld the treatment. They'll have the observation as a post test, and then they'll get the benefits of the additional treatment. So that could be a possibility as well. And then otherwise, is it ethical to lie to research participants when you administer a placebo or a new treatment? They don't know. That's a tough one. And so this is why we have the institutional review boards to help justify, when lying to participants or not telling them is can be justified. And so we need to really think profoundly about what is going to be the impact to their life. So these are all the things for today. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.